Thank you guys for joining me this evening. I am pre-recording tonight so I can go do some adult chores or later on. And he's out of town, so we're not doing our marriage group. But I wanted to talk about 3 different stories. The first is about Matt Gaetz. He has said something rather provocative about Ukraine. And in my research of the topic, I've also found that Roger Waters had said something kind of interesting too. It looks like public opinion might be turning against Ukraine, which is really interesting. I also want to mention the trans surgery doctor who has come out and started blowing the whistle about all of this nonsense. This gets a little bit graphic, and I'm sorry in advance, and it is pretty long. I will have the link in the description if you guys want to read the whole thing. We're just going to read probably the first part and then toward the end where they summarize this stuff. And finally, we're going to talk about how the FBI infiltrated Antifa in Denver. It's going to be really interesting. Let's start with what Roger Waters had to say about Ukraine. So I don't know if you guys remember Roger Waters. He is a member of the band Pink Floyd. Hopefully you all know them. They're classic, fantastic, incredibly talented gentlemen that say they were never under the influence of drugs when they were writing or performing. You decide whether you believe them or not. I'm not convinced. Here we go. Dark Side of the Loon. Roger Waters says Ukraine is not really a country and is run by Nazis amid row with Pink Floyd bandmate David Gilmour for being a, quote, Putin apologist. Pink Floyd singer Roger Waters has said Ukraine is, quote, run by Nazis. In an interview, he said Putin may be leading Russia to the benefit of its people. Former bandmate David Gilmour previously called Waters a Putin apologist, so it sounds like the band is really in fisticuffs over this Ukraine-Russia spat. The row between former Pink Floyd bandmates is deepening after Roger Waters claimed that Ukraine is run by Nazis and not really a country, just days after David Gilmour echoed accusations that he is anti-Semitic. Oh my gosh, ridiculous. In a further broadside, Waters announced he had secretly re-recorded the iconic 1973 album The Dark Side of the Moon without the rest of the band, saying that he can do whatever he wishes to with it as it is my project and I wrote it. Oh wow, good for him. The 2 former bandmates have been arguing for 40 years since Waters left the band, which has sold more than 250 million records in 1985. The recent rekindling the spat came as Gilmour's wife, Polly Sampson, 60, made a series of allegations about Waters, labeling him an anti-Semite to his rotten core, as well as a Putin apologist in a post which was retweeted by her partner. Wow. This sounds really toxic. Waters rebuffed the claims, which he called wildly inaccurate and incendiary, adding that he is taking advice on his position. Waters, a co-founder of Pink Floyd, has drawn some ire for voicing his opinion on Putin's invasion and was denounced by Ukraine yesterday after he told the United Nations Security Council that Russia's attack was not unprovoked. It wasn't unprovoked. The 79-year-old was invited to address the 15-member council by Moscow and appeared yesterday. The invasion was illegal. I condemn it in the strongest possible terms, he said via video, adding, also, the invasion was not unprovoked. I also condemn the provocateurs in the strongest possible terms. Interesting. Ukraine's ambassador to the UN, Sergei, responded with a reference to a Pink Floyd song, how sad for his former fans to see him accepting the role of just a brick in the wall, a wall of Russian disinformation and propaganda. Okay, so you're telling me that someone who is an ambassador to the UN from a country that is at war with another country would say something demeaning about somebody who spoke in favor of their enemies? That's crazy. Blows my mind. He also, referencing an earlier article he'd written on the subject, Waters said it is in his view, some criticisms of Putin were unfair. I wrote about 3 months ago calling Vladimir Putin a gangster. That may have been unfair. It may well be that he's leading his country to the benefit of all the people of Russia. I'm going to disagree with him on that one. I think that Putin is a gangster. I think that he's clearly a leader in the KGB, and that was what put him in this position and what's kept him there for so long. I don't know exactly how long Putin's been in office, but it's not been a short stint at all. He also labeled Ukraine as a deeply divided country that is not really a country at all, and more of a patchy, vague experiment. Interesting. The Pink Floyd co-founder has rebuffed claims of anti-Semitism made online by Polly Sampson, the wife of ex-bandmate Gilmour. Sampson, 60, made the series of claims about Waters, seemingly in response to an article he shared concerning Israel, labeling him anti-Semitic to his rotten core, as well as a Putin apologist. Gilmore supported his wife's accusations. In response, Waters called the claims wildly inaccurate and incendiary. Okay, this we already know. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, well, it is really interesting that this public sentiment is coming out about Ukraine because it appears that some of our American politicians are kind of feeling the same way. And I don't know if you guys know this, but there is a troop, there's a regiment, I think it is, in Ukraine called the Azov Battalion that actually does have Nazi ties. They still wear Nazi insignia on their uniforms. And it's not popular to say this, but the fact of the matter is that Ukraine was stuck between Nazis and communists, and they ended up seeing the Nazis as the lesser evil between those two, which should really tell you something about the communists at the time. But let's see what Matt Gaetz is doing about Ukraine. This is from Responsible Statecraft from today, I believe. Gaetz introduces Ukraine fatigue resolution. Florida congressman leads the call for the U.S. to end its military and financial aid and urges all combatants to reach a peace agreement. Representative Matt Gaetz introduced the Ukraine fatigue resolution on Thursday, continuing a recent push among a subset of Republican lawmakers who want to change course in Washington's support for Ukraine. Good. The resolution states that the United States must end its military and financial aid to Ukraine and urges all combatants to reach a peaceful agreement. As of the time of writing, the resolution has 10 co-sponsors, Representatives Andy Biggs and Paul Gosar, Lauren Boebert, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Anna Paulina Luna, Thomas Massey, Mary Miller, Barry Moore, Ralph Norman, and Matt Rosendale. All the names you want to hear, because these are all the people who are truly actually populist American conservatives who actually want things like a balanced budget, and they want actual interchange between the people and the politicians, and they want politicians to be held accountable by the people that they represent. So these are really the greatest people who could be in favor of this. President Joe Biden must have forgotten his prediction from March 2022, suggesting that arming Ukraine with military equipment will escalate the conflict to World War III. America is in a state of managed decline, and it will exacerbate if we continue to hemorrhage taxpayer dollars toward a foreign war. We must suspend all foreign aid for the war in Ukraine and demand that all combatants in this conflict reach a peace agreement immediately, Gaetz said in a statement. The resolution spells out the increases in financial aid and specific military equipment that have taken place in recent months. As the resolution notes, the United States has been a top contributor of military aid to the Ukraine, compared to its counterparts, having appropriated more than $110 billion in humanitarian, financial, and military aid. This includes more than $29 billion worth of security assistance. Earlier this week, Gaetz criticized President Joe Biden and a bipartisan coalition in Congress for dragging the U.S. into a war that is costing taxpayers and not advancing American interests. His resolution follows a letter sent by a group of Republican legislators in January calling for a cross-cutting report from the Office of Management and Budget on the scale and scope of funding for Ukraine by February 7th. When that deadline passed on Tuesday without such a report, Senator J.D. Vance, who spearheaded the letter, released a statement saying before President Biden spends another taxpayer dollar in Ukraine, he must lay out a clear plan for ending the conflict in a way that advances our national security interests. No more blank checks. I could not possibly be more in favor of this resolution if I had written it myself. It has been unbelievably frustrating to watch the people of Ukraine be given blank check after blank check after blank check when we know, first of all, how unbelievably corrupt our own president has been in regards to them, how involved his son was in the country with Burisma and Viktor Shokin, and Joe Biden's threats to withhold foreign aid from them if they didn't fire the prosecutor who was investing this company. We also know that the country itself is unbelievably corrupt. I don't know if you guys recall this. It was not a huge story, but recently a bunch of their top officials quit in disgrace when it came out that they were unbelievably corrupt as well. And if I recall correctly, billions and billions of American dollars are completely vanished. They're totally gone. But Zelensky and his wife recently were spotted in Paris, I believe, spending a bunch of money on shopping. The Zelenskys have also made it onto the covers of magazines like, I believe, Vanity Fair or Vogue. I don't remember which one it was. I don't read these articles or read these magazines at all, but they are very stylish. They're very popular. People consider them to be the underdog, but to me, they just look like outright scammers. They look like frauds. They look like consistent with everything that I know about Ukraine. I used to work with a lady who was from Ukraine, and she loved her country, but she would have been the first to tell you how ridiculously corrupt it was. In fact, I should probably reach out to her and see what she thinks of all this stuff, because she was very down to earth. A lot of the people from these second world countries, that is formerly communist countries, are very, as the kids say, based in that they do not want communism. They do not want any kind of ridiculous government tyranny, and they understand the implications of a big government actions. Something that we're clearly missing in the US, unfortunately, but I honestly am hugely on the side of Matt Gaetz, Crazy Paul Gosar, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, and J.D. Vance. All of these names are good, awesome names in the conservative movement right now, and I'm really glad that they're putting this forward. Hopefully it gains traction. We'll see what happens. It kind of sounds like the public opinion is turning against Ukraine. Hopefully more will come of this. All right, dips rocketing around the room. Here's the next thing we're going to talk about, and it might get a little graphic, and we're also not going to read this full, really long article. This is from a doctor who used to perform pediatric surgeries for gender-affirming care. I think it was at, I forget what hospital. Yeah, St. Louis Hospital. And we're going to get into it, and I'm going to try to skip the more graphic parts and read the conclusion, as we do with these really long articles. Here's the title. I thought I was saving trans kids. Now I'm blowing the whistle. There are more than 100 pediatric gender clinics across the U.S. I worked at one. What's happening to children is morally and medically appalling. This is written by Jamie Reed, and she is the doctor in question. This picture is of Jamie Reed at home in Missouri. I am a 42-year-old St. Louis native, a queer woman, and politically to the left of Bernie Sanders. Okay, so you know firmly where she stands, but she's still blowing the whistle on this, and for that I have to say, I salute you, good lady, because this is very important work that you're going to do. Let's see how she breaks it down. My worldview has deeply shaped my career. I've spent my professional life providing counseling to vulnerable populations, children in foster care, sexual minorities, the poor. For almost 4 years, I worked at the Washington University School of Medicine Division of Infectious Disease with teens and young adults who were HIV positive. Many of them were trans or otherwise gender nonconforming, and I could relate. Through childhood and adolescence, I did a lot of gender questioning myself. I'm now married to a trans man, and together we are raising my 2 biological children from a previous marriage and 3 foster children we hope to adopt. Wow, interesting. All that led me to a job in 2018 as a case manager at the Washington University Transgender Center at St. Louis Children's Hospital, which had been established a year earlier. I just want to stop and point out that less than 6 months ago, they were telling us that this never happened to children. But here we are. There is a gender transition center at a children's hospital in St. Louis, and Boston Children's Hospital also offers similar services. This does happen. They were lying. The center's working assumption was that the earlier you treat kids with gender dysphoria, the more anguish you can prevent later on. I understand. That makes sense to me. And people who operate in good faith on this premise are sometimes the strongest advocates of this kind of surgery. It is a very misguided kind of compassion. This premise was shared by the center's doctors and therapists. Given their expertise, I assumed that abundant evidence backed this consensus. A dangerous assumption. During the 4 years I worked at the clinic as a case manager, I was responsible for patient intake and oversight. Around 1,000 distressed young people came through our doors. The majority of them received hormone prescriptions that can have life-altering consequences, including sterility. I left the clinic in November of last year because I could no longer participate in what was happening. By the time I departed, I was certain that the way the American medical system is treating these patients is the opposite of the promise we make to do no harm. Instead, we are permanently harming the vulnerable patients in our care. Today, I am speaking out. I am doing so knowing how toxic the public conversation around this is, around this highly contentious issue, and the ways that my testimony might be misused. I am doing so knowing that I am putting myself at serious personal and professional risk. Good for her. This is the action of a very brave person. This is her face. This is her name. Good for her. More power to her. Almost everyone in my life advised me to keep my head down, but I cannot in good conscience do so, because what is happening to scores of children is far more important than my comfort. And what is happening to them is morally and medically appalling. The floodgates open. Soon after my arrival at the Transgender Center, I was struck with a lack of formal protocols for treatment. The center's physician co-directors were essentially the sole authority. That's a huge red flag. A lot of times in nursing, they really do everything according to an actual series of rules that are set ahead of time. Is this happening? Okay, you need to check this box and this box. If these two things happen, you need to do this. If this third thing happens, you need to do this. It's very much like a tree of options that nurses are given for each circumstance because they have very serious research that they've tried to follow for each of these instances, and they try to make sure that nobody's let down by somebody who's just trying to do things off the cuff. At first, the patient population was tipped toward what used to be the traditional instance of a child with gender dysphoria, a boy, often quite young, who wanted to be a girl. Until 2015 or so, a very small number of these boys comprised the population of pediatric gender dysphoria cases. Then, across the Western world, there began to be a dramatic increase in a new population. Teenage girls, with many with no previous history of gender distress, suddenly declared they were transgender and demanded immediate treatment with testosterone. This is exactly the premise of Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage. You guys should definitely check it out. I still am not sure if I get that title right. Check out Abigail Schreier on Amazon. I certainly saw this at the center. One of my jobs was to do intake for new patients and their families. When I started, there were probably 10 such calls a month. When I left, there were 50, and about 70% of the new patients were girls. Sometimes clusters of girls arrived from the same high school. That's right. That's because this is a social contagion, which is what Abigail unpacks in her book. This concerned me, but I didn't feel I was in the right position to sound some kind of alarm back then. There was a team of about 8 of us, and only one other person brought up the kinds of questions I had. Anyone who raised doubts ran the risk of being called a transphobe. That's how they shut down conversation. That's how they're hurting all of these children, is just by calling the people who are most genuinely concerned about them transphobic. It's very weak, but it works. The girls who came to us had many comorbidities: depression, anxiety, ADHD, eating disorders, obesity. Many were diagnosed with autism or had autism-like symptoms. A report last year on a British pediatric transgender center found that about 1/3 of the patients referred to them were on the autism spectrum. Frequently, our patients declared they had disorders that no one believed they had. We had patients who said they had Tourette syndrome, but they didn't. That they had tic disorders, but they didn't. That they had multiple personalities. They didn't. The doctors privately recognized these false self-diagnoses as manifestation of social contagion. They even acknowledged that suicide has an element of social contagion. But when I said the clusters of girls streaming into our service looked as if the gender issues might be a manifestation of social contagion, the doctors said gender identity reflected something innate. That's right, because they make money off these girls. To begin transitioning, the girls needed a letter of support from a therapist, usually one we recommended, who they had to see only once or twice for the green light. To make it more efficient for the therapists, we offered them a template for how to write a letter in support of transition. Wow, they really make this as easy as possible. The next stop was a single visit to the endocrinologist for a testosterone prescription. That's all it took. Oh, wow, this is worse than I thought. When a female takes testosterone, the profound and permanent effects of the hormone can be seen in a matter of months. Voices drop, beards sprout, body fat is redistributed. Sexual interest explodes, aggression increases, and mood can be unpredictable. Our patients were told about some side effects, including sterility. But after working at the center, I came to believe that teenagers are simply not capable of fully grasping what it means to make the decision to become infertile while still a minor. Yes! This is what we've been saying. We don't say this stuff because we hate children. We say it because we care about them. We really do. And we don't want these children to be sterilized in ways that they don't understand when they're a teenager. I'm glad she realized this, and I'm so glad she's saying this, but it's really frustrating. Side effects. Many encounters with patients emphasized to me how little these young people understood the profound impacts changing gender would have on their bodies and minds. But the center downplayed the negative consequences and emphasized the need for transition. As the center's website said, left untreated, gender dysphoria has any number of consequences from self-harm to suicide. But when you take away the gender dysphoria by allowing a child to be who he or she is, we're noticing that goes away. I would really like to see the source on that one. The studies we have show these kids often wind up functioning psychologically, psychosocially as well as or better than their peers. Doubt. If your source is, dude, trust me, I'm going to have to see more than that. There are no reliable studies showing this. Indeed, the experiences of many of the center's patients prove how false these assertions are. Here is an example. On Friday, May 1st, 2020, a colleague emailed me about a 15-year-old male patient. Oh dear, I am concerned that the patient does not understand what bicalutamide does. I responded, I don't think we start anything honestly right now. Wow, this is really an exchange they had. I think that this is a letter saying wait more time, and yes, I think that blank does not understand what it does. Bicalutamide is a medication used to treat metastatic prostate cancer, and one of its side effects is that it feminizes the bodies of men who take it, including the appearance of breasts. The center prescribed this cancer drug as a puberty blocker and feminizing agent for boys. As with most cancer drugs, bicalutamide has a long list of side effects, and this patient experienced one of them, liver toxicity. Oh my gosh, that's serious. He was sent to another unit of the hospital for evaluation and immediately taken off the drug. Afterward, his mother sent an electronic message to the transgender center saying that we were lucky her family was not the type to sue. She's not wrong. How little patients understood what they were getting into was illustrated by a call we received at the center in 2020 from a 17-year-old biological female patient who was on testosterone. She said she was bleeding from the vagina. In less than an hour, she had soaked through an extra heavy pad, her jeans, and a towel she had wrapped around her waist. The nurse at the center told her to go to the emergency room right away. Yes, because if you continue to bleed like that, you will die. We found out later this girl had, oh gosh. Okay, so I'm giving you guys a graphic warning because she explains exactly what happened here, and it is not good. But this is something that we need to know because we need to go into these conversations where we will be called transphobes, fully equipped with the facts. We found out later this girl had intercourse, and because testosterone thins the vaginal tissues, her vaginal canal had ripped open. She had to be sedated and given surgery to repair the damage. She wasn't the only vaginal laceration case we heard about. That kind of makes me tear up. That sounds like hell on earth. Other girls were disturbed by the effects of testosterone on their clitoris, which enlarged and grows into what looks like a microphallus or a tiny penis. I counseled one patient whose enlarged clitoris now extended below her vulva, and it chafed and rubbed painfully in her jeans. I advised her to get the kind of compression undergarments worn by biological men who dress to pass as female. At the end of the call, I thought to myself, wow, we hurt this kid. There are rare conditions in which babies are born with atypical genitalia, cases that call for sophisticated care and compassion. But clinics like the one where I worked are creating a whole cohort of kids with atypical genitals, and most of these teens haven't even had sex yet. They just had no idea who they were going to be as adults. Yet all it took for them to permanently transform themselves was 1 or 2 short conversations with a therapist. Being put on powerful doses of testosterone or estrogen, enough to try to trick your body into mimicking the opposite sex, affects the rest of the body. I doubt that any parent who's ever consented to give their kid testosterone, a lifelong treatment, knows that they're also possibly signing their kid up for blood pressure medicine, cholesterol medication, and perhaps sleep apnea and diabetes. But sometimes the parents' understanding of what they had agreed to do to their children came forcefully. On Thursday, June 9th, 2022, she got an email. Hello, please be advised that I'm revoking my consent for this course of medical treatment. Grades have dropped. There's been an inpatient behavioral health visit, and now he's on 5 different medications, Lexapro, Trazodone, Buspar, etc., etc. These are strong medicines used to treat things like depression and sleep disorders. Blank is a shell of his former self, riddled with anxiety, Who knows if it's because this hormone blockers or other medication. I revoke my consent. I want the hormone blocker removed. Thank you. Good. Smart parent, but it's probably too late. Neglected and mentally ill patients. Besides teenage girls, another new group was referred to us. Young people from the inpatient psychiatric unit or the emergency department of St. Louis Children's Hospital. The mental health of these kids was deeply concerning. There were diagnoses like schizophrenia, PTSD, bipolar disorder, and more. Often they were already on a fistful of pharmaceuticals. This was tragic but unsurprising given the profound trauma some had been through. Yet no matter how much suffering or pain a child had endured or how very little treatment and love they had received, our doctors viewed gender transition, even with all the expense and hardship it entailed, as the solution. Some weeks it felt as though almost our entire caseload was nothing but disturbed young people. For example, one teenager came to us in the summer of 2022 when he was 17 years old, living in a lockdown facility because he'd been sexually abusing dogs. He'd had an awful childhood. His mother was a drug addict, his father was imprisoned, and he grew up in foster care. Whatever treatment he may have been getting, it wasn't working. During our intake, I learned from another caseworker that when he got out, he planned to reoffend because he believed the dogs had willingly submitted. Somewhere along the way, he expressed a desire to become female, so he ended up being seen at our center. From there, he went to a psychologist at the hospital who was known to approve virtually everyone seeking transition. Then our doctor recommended feminizing hormones. At the time, I wondered if this was being done as a form of chemical castration. That is a very valid question. The same thought came up again in another case. This one was in the spring of 2022 and concerned a young man who had intense obsessive-compulsive disorder that manifested as a desire to cut off his penis after he masturbated. This patient expressed no gender dysphoria, but he got hormones too. I asked the doctor what the protocol he was following was, but I never got a straight answer. Wow. So, I don't know if you guys know this about J.K. Rowling, but she actually wrote under a pseudonym called Robert Galbraith. And she wrote a book called The Cuckoo's Calling that was about a veteran who had been through, I want to say, the Afghanistan war, and he had lost the lower part of his leg, I think at the knee. It had been amputated and he had to use a prosthetic. And over the course of this book, this detective, his name's Cormoran Strike, he comes up against a villain who wants to cut parts of their own body off. And I don't remember their gender, but it's very interesting how she writes this instance of a veteran who lost a part of his own body going toe to toe with somebody who wanted to voluntarily remove part of their body. I really need to reread that book because it's such an interesting and stark contrast between someone who has no choice in what happens to them and someone who is wanting to do something like this. And she wrote it very compassionately. She doesn't deserve all the flack she gets, although she certainly lit the fire that is currently burning her. That is definitely to her own downfall. But I digress on that point. You guys should definitely check it out. She lists a whole bunch of disturbing cases. I'm going to see what she concludes. We're going to scroll right down to the bottom. Those cases were disturbing enough. Wow, I feel really bad for these kids. So let's read this last part. What I want to see happen. Perfect. For a couple of weeks, I tried to put everything behind me and settled into my new job as a clinical research coordinator, managing studies regarding children undergoing bone marrow transplants. Then I came across comments from Dr. Rachel Levine, a transgender woman who is a high official at the Federal Department of Health and Human Services. The article read, Levine, the U.S. Assistant Secretary for Health, said that clinics are proceeding carefully and that no American children are receiving drugs or hormones for gender dysphoria who shouldn't. I felt stunned and sickened. It wasn't true. And I knew that from deep firsthand experience. So I started writing down everything I could about my experience at the Transgender Center. 2 weeks ago, I brought my concerns and documents to the attention of Missouri's Attorney General. He's a Republican. I'm a progressive. But the safety of children should not be a matter for our culture wars. I think she means to say it shouldn't be a case of partisanship, because that's entirely true. It should be a case for our culture wars, and we should all rally around the fact that children deserve protection, and they deserve not to be mutilated by people who receive monetary compensation for that mutilation. Given the secretary and secrecy, excuse me. Let me try that again. Given the secrecy and lack of rigorous standards that characterize youth gender transition across the country, I believe that to ensure the safety of American children, we need a moratorium on the hormonal and surgical treatment of young people with gender dysphoria, yes. In the past 15 years, according to Reuters, the U.S. has gone from having no pediatric gender clinics to more than 100. A thorough analysis should be undertaken to find out what has been done to their parents and why, and what the long-term consequences are. Done to their patients, excuse me. What has been done to their patients and why. There is a clear path for us to follow. Just last year, England shut down the Tavistock Center, the only youth gender clinic in the country, after an investigation revealed shoddy practices and poor patient treatment. Sweden and Finland, too, have investigated pediatric transition and greatly curbed the practice, finding there is insufficient evidence of help and danger of great harm. Some critics describe the kind of treatment offered at places like the Transgender Center where I worked as a kind of national experiment, but that's wrong. Experiments are supposed to be carefully designed. Hypotheses are supposed to be tested ethically. The doctors I worked alongside at the Transgender Center said frequently about the treatment of our patients, "We are building the plane while we're flying it." No one should be a passenger on that kind of aircraft. This is so well written, and I am so impressed with this lady for coming out and saying it. She's also a very good author. Despite my terrible reading, she's actually very easy to read, and I strongly recommend this. This is from thefp.com. I will have a link in the description for you guys as well. I'm going to look up something from Matt Walsh as well, because he recently had an interaction with, I want to say, Tennessee state lawmakers, and it was fiery, and he made it happen. So let's see if we can find this link. Oh yeah, here we go. We're going to listen to this. Today I testified at a committee hearing in support of a bill banning child mutilation in Tennessee. A Democrat on the commission asked what qualifies me to speak on the subject. It was a very dumb question, but I tried my best to answer it for him. Let's hear this.
Can you give us a summary of your educational background or your healthcare education experience?
Mr. Walsh, you're recognized.
My experience in healthcare?
Your educational background. I'm just curious. You testified as to a lot of your own research. So I'm curious for what purpose you do that and what background you have to qualify you to speak to that.
Well, my background that qualifies me to speak to this is that I'm a human being with a brain and common sense, and I have a soul. And so, therefore, I think it's a really bad idea to chemically castrate children. That is my experience. Also, I did, now it's true, I didn't go to college, but I did go to school long enough to learn how to read, so I can read the data for myself, and that's exactly what I've done.
Representative Clements, you're
And for what purpose do you conduct your research and use this brain of yours?
Mr. Walsh, you're recognized.
I use it for the purpose of trying to protect children from being castrated and mutilated. That's one of the things I try to do.
You don't use it to, thank you, Mr. Chairman, you don't use it to get clicks on your publication?
Well, are you using it right now to try to get clicks with this interaction?
On.
I really like the idea of getting, of drawing attention to the fact that this is happening to children. I know you seem to find it very amusing. I don't.
So this actually wasn't the interaction that I had in mind, but I really appreciate Matt Walsh doing this. I remember when I first left high school, I was in a homeschool group of like people who were leaving homeschooling, and there was a lot of hatred for Matt Walsh at the time just because he was a conservative Christian. And I've been so impressed with everything he's done in the state of Tennessee and everywhere else as well. Like he went up to Virginia to talk to people about this stuff there, about the school board stuff, and oh, you know what? This is the link. Yeah. So let's watch this one too.
What was your, are you a pediatric, what was your specialty?
Dr. Hamada.
I am board certified in, I can't even talk, obstetrics and gynecology, as well as family medicine with a focus on sports medicine as well.
Representative Clements.
No endocrinology or pediatrics?
Pediatrics is part of family medicine, and then also with regards to endocrinology, that's a big portion of what we do in obstetrics and gynecology.
And what's your formal training in that?
4 years of medical school and residency with oral and written boards.
So this credentialism is exactly the card they try to play, and they're going to have a hard time with this lady who used to work at this gender clinic. It's no joke. She's eminently qualified as well, and she knows exactly what she saw. I'm looking for this exchange where they tried to discredit Matt Walsh by calling to mind something that Media Matters had brought up against him. They were saying that he thought that 16-year-olds should get married, when in reality, he had merely mentioned several years ago, it was something like 5 or 10 years ago, that he mentioned that that was something that used to happen. Marriages used to happen much younger, and that is factually correct, objectively true, and not necessarily something that we should emulate today. So these Democrats kept trying to pin him, and he kept being able to outsmart them because he's trying to pursue the truth. And I really hope that Jamie Reed has a similar effect on the conversation, because what she has to say is super important. So I'm really going to recommend you guys go over and read that article. Now we're going to read this from the Intercept before we close. Here we have The Snitch in the Silver Hearse, which is a very dramatic title. The FBI paid a violent felon to infiltrate Denver's racial justice movement. Oh, that's very interesting. I wonder why they did that. As racial justice protests broke out nationwide in the summer of 2020, a man driving a silver hearse became a regular in the demonstrations in Denver. He was a paunchy 5'7" with a ruddy complexion and wore military fatigues with patches on the sleeves. By activist standards, he was an old-timer, pushing 50 as he swaggered through crowds of teens and 20-something protesters, a cigar clamped in his lips. I didn't know much about him, but he drove a hearse, said Zebedios Zeb Hall, a black activist in Denver. Inside this hearse was a lot of guns, AR-15s, and all other kinds of stuff. Wow. The drivers of the hearse filled with guns was Michael Adam Windecker II. He went by the nickname Mickey and boasted of having been a soldier in the French Foreign Legion and the Peshmerga, the Kurdish fighting force known most recently for battling the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. He claimed to have traveled to those battlefields and trained anti-fascist activists there in weapons, hand-to-hand combat, and explosives. He was just this badass dude talking about how he worked in the foreign military and how he was here for the Black Lives Matter movement, Hall remembered. Denver was a hotspot during the summer of 2020, with protesters enraged not just by George Floyd's killing in Minneapolis, but also by the senseless death of Elijah McClain, who was forcefully subdued by police in 2019 in Aurora, a Denver suburb, and injected with a lethal dose of ketamine. Wow, I'd forgotten about that one, but that was in Aurora. Trey Quinn, a muscular black activist with a beard and large framed glasses, led some Denver protests. One night, after Quinn had addressed a group of demonstrators, several young activists introduced him to Windecker. Hey, this guy's really, really dope. He's legit. He knows his stuff, Quinn remembered being told by the fresh-faced activists. We're going to skip some of the human interest stuff and read what he gets into. But Shelby and many other activists in Denver were wrong about the man behind the wheel of the silver hearse. Windecker was a Fed. The FBI paid him tens of thousands of dollars in cash to infiltrate and spy on racial justice groups during the summer of 2020. That's very interesting, because you know what the FBI didn't do in the summer of 2020? Stop any of this. Prevent any of the billions of dollars in damages. Prevent any of the almost 40 deaths that resulted because of the Summer of Love. From the last year, I've been investigating Windecker and his work for the FBI. I tell that story in detail in a new 10-episode documentary podcast, Alphabet Boys, from Western Sound and iHeart Podcasts. As part of this investigation, I reviewed more than 300 pages of FBI reports and hours of FBI undercover recordings, as well as publicly available videos recorded by Denver demonstrators and by Windecker himself. I also examined dozens of court files relating to Windecker's past and interviewed more than 36 racial justice activists who encountered Windecker during the summer of 2020. That is some serious journalistic work. Hats off to the Intercept, as always. The FBI declined to comment on Windecker and the investigation in Denver and refused to respond in writing to a list of questions I sent. How surprising. Windecker wouldn't tell me much either. After I left a note at his old apartment south of Denver explaining that I wanted to interview him about his work for the FBI, he called me. I do not work for the FBI, he said. I've never worked for the FBI. If you get proof of me working for the FBI, then I'll say otherwise, but there's no proof because I didn't work for them. Smart. I explained that I had FBI reports and recordings to the contrary. I don't talk to the press, I don't talk to politicians, and I don't talk to police, Windecker told me before hanging up. That's actually a pretty good policy. FBI payment receipt records signed by Windecker show that he was paid more than $20,000 for his work during the summer of 2020 when the FBI aggressively pursued racial justice and left-wing activism based on nothing more than First Amendment protected activities. Fascinating. We know that the Intercept is relatively left-leaning, but it is really interesting that the FBI infiltrated Antifa. The story of the Bureau's infiltration of racial justice activist groups is particularly relevant now as House Republicans launch a new committee chaired by Rep. Jim Jordan that seems exclusively focused on the FBI's alleged targeting of right-wing groups. I agree. We should figure out if the FBI has been targeting anyone, if indeed it was only for constitutionally protected free speech. Now, in the instance of the Summer of Love, we know there was a whole hell of a lot more than constitutionally protected free speech protests going on, especially in cities where things were burned, things were looted, people's businesses were destroyed, and people lost their lives. The Intercept likes to call these protests. These were riots, and they need to be honest with themselves. The FBI's work in Denver, where Windecker with Windecker as its eyes and ears on the street, demonstrates the falsity of that narrative. Does it though? Doesn't it tell you though that if they were watching left-wing groups, they would also necessarily be watching right-wing groups? Do you really think they're more favorable toward the right now, especially under Joe Biden? I don't. I would like a word with the author of this article, although I respect everything he did to get to the bottom of this. I just don't like his views on it. While on the FBI payroll, Windecker became an organizer of Denver's racial justice demonstrations and ultimately undermined the social movement, gaining momentum there by deploying the same controversial tactics the FBI used to devastating effect against black political groups during the civil rights movement. Interesting. Until now, little has been revealed about the FBI's actions in the summer of 2020. The Denver undercover probe involving Windecker provides the first look behind the scenes at how the FBI viewed and investigated racial justice groups during that turbulent summer. Yeah, it was turbulent, wasn't it? I think I'm going to skip part of it. It is very interesting, and I will strongly recommend you guys read it just because I want to wrap this before 6. Let's see what he says at the end. He gives all his evidence. We don't investigate ideology. Sure, they don't. I can't help feeling that we should actually feel a great sense of commonality by looking at the FBI with great disdain and suspicion. Because when it comes down to it, we know that the FBI isn't on our side. They've never been on the side of citizens. In fact, he just mentioned himself that this is something that they weaponized against the Black freedom movement, the civil rights era stuff. We know they've been doing this. Why wouldn't they also be using it against the right wing? We know for a fact the government does not like right-wing dissidents at all, even constitutionally protected dissidents. All right, let's see here at the end. Oh, he did not end this well. Okay. After he made the video, Windecker and his silver hearse disappeared. In July 2021, nearly a year after he'd bought the gun for Windecker, federal agents arrested Hall. He pleaded guilty to a felony firearms violation for buying a gun with the government's money for the government's informant and received 3 years of probation. That was the extent of the plot Windecker and the FBI succeeded in engineering among the racial justice activists that summer. Many of the activist groups in Denver have splintered or disbanded. There was a lot of distrust. Activists there told me they suspected government agents had infiltrated the groups to encourage the violence that occurred, but until now, they'd never had proof. The FBI caused violence here, Hall said. They don't want people to know that. That's really interesting that you mentioned that, author of this article, because I'm going to point you in the direction of the Gretchen Whitmer kidnapping case. Heavily influenced by the FBI. Yes, jury learns of rogue FBI informants in the Whitmer kidnap case, but not the full story. Yes. In fact, from my understanding of the Whitmer kidnapping case, a majority of the involved people were actually feds. Isn't that interesting? It's almost like this is a bipartisan issue that we should be on the same page about. This is not something that we can use against the other. The FBI is the enemy of the people, and the sooner we figure that out, the better off we're going to be. But I just wanted to make you guys aware of that article. Definitely the most important article of this evening was from that doctor from St. Louis. That was heartbreaking. I'm sorry it was a little triggering to read, but it's very, very important that we understand this stuff and that we come to terms with what exactly happens and why we're fighting. And then in the case of Ukraine, interesting stuff there too. I really hope that the public opinion turns against Ukraine because as far as I'm concerned, it appears to be just a huge money laundering scheme, a black hole into which we pour taxpayer dollars until the end of time if something like Matt Gaetz' plan is not implemented. Thank you guys so much for joining me tonight. I will see you all tomorrow, likely live streaming, and then Andy will be back later tomorrow night. Very excited for that. Happy to have him back home. Once again, thanks for joining me. Make sure you follow me on Twitter. And until next time, bye guys.